welcome. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined the call. I can see already from the quick introductions that we've got colleagues from a huge number of different agencies coming from China, from the US, from Somalia, Jordan, and growing representations of countries and organizations as you all introduce yourself. So we're really pleased to have you with us. My name is Susanna Davis. I am one of the two co-leads for the Child Protection Minimum Standards Working Group within the Alliance. And I am also joined today by my fellow co-lead, Joanna Wedge, and by one of the Alliance coordinators, Hani Mansourian. So I'll just let Joanna and Hani introduce themselves.
Hi everybody, this is Joanna Wedge. As Susanna says, I am the co-lead with her on the Child Protection Minimum Standards Working Group. I work with UNICEF, and I've been part of the working group, the CPMS Working Group, for about 6 years in different roles. So it's really wonderful to have the co-leadership at the moment and be working on the rollout of the 2019 edition of the CPMS. I just wanted to say how wonderful it is that all of you are giving time to this webinar, because we know that there's great interest around the world to, great uptake in using the new edition. But I also wanted to say that you could have just waited for the recording, but you're not, you're here live. And so we're really hoping you're gonna come to us with questions and suggestions and ideas when we have our discussion session at the end, towards the end of the webinar itself. Hani, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Hani Mansourian, and I'm the coordinator of the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. Delighted to be here and speaking with all of you guys. And as Joanna and Susanna said, it's really exciting to see the interest. There are 71 participants on the call, and it's still growing. It's a great turnout. Joanna, do you want me to quickly give a bit of background?
Yeah, since we're have so many people here, if you wanted to give a couple of minutes, yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll just basically give you guys the teaser, because the experts, Susanna and Joanna, will be going in much more depth of the conversation. Yeah, maybe a bit of history for some of you. I know a lot of you are familiar with where the minimum standards come from, but for those who may not be, the whole effort started back in 2009-10 in thinking about the need of the sector to have minimum standards. And one of the models we've been looking at was, of course, the INE minimum standards, which is for the education sector, but also the sphere standards and other companion standards. So in 2012, the first revision was launched, and between 2012 and 2019, when the current revision was launched, or edition was launched, minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action became the go-to reference document for practitioners, policymakers, donors. It really had a massive impact in professionalizing our sector and helping us both increase quality of the work that we do, but also have a framework for accountability towards the populations that we serve. So around 2016, the need was recognized, or 2017 actually. The need was identified to start an update process. Originally, the ambition was to but because this is child protection is generally such a young sector, there was a lot of evidence and change and lessons that were learned, both from the application of the minimum standards, but also from generally practice in the field. So between 2012 and 2017, there was already quite a bit of new things that we thought needs to be incorporated. And I'll just mention a few of them. The idea of cross-sectoral work has evolved quite a bit. You all see, and I believe Joanna and Susanna will talk about the fourth pillar, which is working across sectors, in my view, has really improved and changed. The idea of focusing more on prevention and prevention of harm to children rather than only responding has kind of evolved quite a bit since the original version. there's quite a bit more, but I'll just mention one more, and that's the application to refugee context, which was one of the really welcome changes in this revision, with a lot of input and collaboration with UNHCR. We now have a document that does not only apply to non-refugee settings, but also to refugee settings. I'll just mention the last thing, that I also personally am really excited about the framing of the whole standards around the socio-ecological model, and the whole chapter 3, pillar 3, sorry, and the standards in that are a really exciting move forward, I believe, for the sector. And I believe Susanna and Joanna will give you more detail on that, but I wanted to flag it as a teaser again. Without further ado, I hand back over to Joanna and Susanna, and I wish everyone a pleasant learning experience.
Thanks so much, Hani. Lovely to have all those teasers that we'll be drawing out over the next hour and a bit. But we have one more colleague from the Alliance Secretariat with us. Hopefully her microphone's working. Audrey, do you want to say hello?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Audrey, the other coordinator of the Alliance, and very pleased to see you all connected to get to know a little bit more about the 2019 edition of the CPMS.
So as Hani had pointed to, we are building off the 2019 edition, obviously builds off the original edition of the CPMS. And we know that it was a very, very popular tool. People were eager to have this tool as they were working in humanitarian settings, and also that our development colleagues were eager to have this tool, as there are no minimum standards really for protecting children at a global level in day-to-day life. It was difficult to track, it is difficult to track how many people have picked up the CPMS, but we were able to estimate about 74,000 people use the 2012 edition in over 50 countries around the world. There were about 14 translations that we were aware of in languages such as Urdu, Japanese, Chinese, Russian, Swahili, and so on. The minimum standards, as many of you know, after the contextualization, we know that towards, I believe it was about 2017, the CPMS became an app as well. And it was an app loaded onto the Humanitarian Standards Partnership platform. And it was the second most downloaded set of standards. So the first was Sphere, which, as you know, probably have 4 different sectors within the document. And then minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action is the top handbook, or the top set of standards in a single document that was downloaded from that HSP app. So we know that there's lots and lots of interest in the CPMS, and that has carried over to our next edition, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Hani has flagged already that there were indeed gaps that we were aware of as we started to implement the CPMS, and I'm sure for those of you who are using it, you can think of some of the gaps. So some of the core principles were not as clearly embedded in the document as others. So the 4 CRC principles, which are just as important as the others, were separated out in the first handbook and sometimes weren't as integrated into the discussions around the principles that guide our child protection work in humanitarian settings. So that was something we wanted to address. Practitioners, donors, etc., were telling us that they really wanted to see a more comprehensive and realistic measurement tool or set of indicators, and so that is something, as you'll see, that we've worked on quite a lot in this edition, the 2019 edition. There was more emphasis needed on the changing situation on the ground, so the increasing role of local actors, their capacity, their relevance to protecting children in humanitarian action. So we wanted to make sure that was more strongly forefronted in the next edition. Issues around accountability and inclusion of all children, whatever background, whatever family makeup, whatever identity they had, so to ensure that they were really thread and seen throughout the whole document. As Hani has mentioned, we wanted a stronger emphasis on prevention and not just on preparedness and response to the risks that children face. And then in our pillar 4, where we had been talking about mainstreaming, we wanted to expand that to look at other ways to integrate child protection into the work of other sectors and to collaborate with other sectors on improving the the reality is the situation for children. So the situation had evolved since kind of 2011, 2012, as the original edition came together. There was more evidence around more effective interventions, and we wanted to be sure that that was reflected, that the document really is as evidence-based as possible, and the guidance and so on is really up to date and the best that we could possibly provide practitioners. And then the cross-cutting issues had evolved. For example, issues around cash, the use of cash and voucher assistance had really been very, very small in 2011, 2012, but had come a long way by the time we were finalizing the document in 2019. We wanted to ensure that we were as current and as inclusive as possible around issues of gender, as well as for children and families where there are lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual, or intersex members. So we wanted to be sure to reflect that appropriately throughout the document. Environmental concerns. Many people raised the issue of climate change and the climate crisis, and how is that affecting our humanitarian work? How is that affecting children? How is that affecting our protection of children? So this is something we wanted to address in the introduction and where possible through the document. And then another cutting issue that has really evolved over the past 5-6 years is around mobile programming, and making sure that when we can't always be on the ground, that our partners are on the ground or different actors are on the ground, that we are programming well through them. And that also mobile in the sense of not static, that there is programming that moves with children, there is programming where children actually are. They don't have to always come to us, but we are going to them as much as possible. So these are some of the cross-cutting issues that we wanted to ensure were really up to date in the 2019 edition, in the next edition. As Hani has mentioned, we wanted to ensure that the new edition would be applicable to a wider range of contexts. So for example, children and families who are refugees, displaced, or in migration contexts. And we've worked closely with UNHCR and other partners to make sure that that is woven throughout the handbook and all the tools that we're using to support the 2019 edition, and that it is accurate and as specific as possible to those specific kinds of contexts. Another quite specific context was infectious disease outbreaks, so settings where there is an infectious disease, as we're looking at currently around the world, but obviously around Ebola and cholera and so on. So there's a specific guidance note that had come out from the Alliance, and we wanted to make sure that it was properly included throughout the minimum standards, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Urban areas, we know that increasingly disasters are not just in peri-urban or rural areas, but in urban settings as well, as the population has moved so much to urban areas. So we wanted to ensure that the document really takes into account some of the specificities of operating, of living, and then for us to be operating in cities and so on. And then, as we know, some of children's lives are now lived on the internet and online, and in situations in humanitarian settings where children continue to be online, then what are the dangers and opportunities for us to protect children, to reach out to them, and so on. So these are, as I say, some of the new contexts or new issues that we wanted to be addressing in the next edition. So just very quickly about our revision process. Some of you I know were involved in it, which is great to see your continued interest, and hopefully you see your work and your ideas really reflected in the document. The expert teams reworked each of the standards, and as you know, many of you, we now have 2 additional standards, so there are 28 standards in this edition. That work then went out to country level and global consultations. So in that process, we had 1,900 individual contributors, huge number for this kind of revision. 1,100 people participated in meetings, took their time to come together and discuss some of the standards or the principles or the background or the annexes and so on. This time around, we really reached out to government colleagues, as well as had some sessions with families and caregivers, as well as children themselves. We had feedback from 82 countries around the world and 85 different agencies, many of them, most of them Alliance members, but some of them for various reasons outside of Alliance membership, fed into the document itself, which again, we're really proud of, to have such a large interagency commitment to revising the child protection minimum standards. The process took 24 months. We launched the document in October of 2019, and as we're going to show you, we continue to have our 10 principles really at the heart of the minimum standards, as well as these 28 standards themselves. So with that, we want to now introduce the minimum standards to you. And I will pass my mic over to Susanna, and she will take the screen as well at this point.
Thanks very much. This is kind of introducing the 2019 edition. It's, as you can see, it's kind of the same great handbook. A lot of the visual elements of the handbook will look very similar to you, but yeah, new and improved effectively. So the things to kind of remember as we start going through and unpacking the 2019 edition is that these continue to be the global standards that are a benchmark for our sector for child protection and humanitarian action, just as the 2012 ones were, and they really represent kind of an increased professionalization and new evidence in our sector. And they're how we communicate with donors, with other members of our sectors, with people from other sectors in humanitarian response, and also with kind of affected children communities themselves, what our values are and what our priorities are in terms of response. And the second thing is just to kind of highlight, as many of you will probably know from your own experiences with the 2012 edition, that contextualization of the CPMS is definitely something that we encourage. It's a process that can create ownership of the standards at every level, particularly within kind of a country level response. And it's something that we kind of support through our own guidance on how to do rollout of the 2019 edition, which we'll continue to talk about a little bit later in the presentation. Also, just as Joanna kind of was highlighting in the revision, the CPMS remain kind of a collaborative interagency tool, and we are very connected with other standards through the Humanitarian Standards Partnership. We're sort of structured in the same way. Our indicators follow the same guidelines. We're also kind of incorporated all of the principles and the guidance from the core humanitarian standard. Where appropriate, we've made linkages with Inspire and are quite linked to the humanitarian inclusion standards for people with disabilities and also older people. So just to say that we don't kind of happen in a vacuum, we're linked to all the other humanitarian standards, and we try and be complementary to the other guidance that is out there. So just in terms of the design, for those of you who haven't gotten your hands on the handbook yet or haven't maybe had the chance to explore the online version, it is the same great design that you will be very familiar with from when you've had your hands on the 2012 edition. So it's the same sort of color coding, the same, if you're holding the physical handbooks, the same tabs to help you find things and flip through, the spiral binding, to kind of remind us of the connections and cross-cutting issues to consider. And these are sort of in the columns throughout the standards, and you'll see them both in the online version, in the Humanitarian Standards Partnership app, and in the actual physical CPMS handbook. So some of the ones that you see on your screen right now are the ones that are talking about integrated programming with other sectors. But I can also share with you a few of the others. And I may speed through this a little bit, just given the time and the desire to spend as much time as possible on discussion and on answering your questions at the end. But if you'd like, you're very welcome to use the chat box to guess what some of the icons are. So we've got this one that's just come up on the right side of your screen. Any guesses or suggestions of what this one might mean? You're welcome to use the chat box. Oh, I see a couple people have. Let me see if I can. We see, so Kath has said migration, and that's absolutely correct. This icon is sort of used to highlight when there are issues of displacement that need to be considered. Exactly, lovely to see lots of people chiming in. And we've got another one, this one that's appeared now at the bottom. Any ideas about this one? I might just put up I see a few responses coming in. Case management. I'm impressed with the group already. You guys seem to be quite switched on. So this is case management. This is the one that we were trying to highlight sort of with the, it's not, maybe not the greatest, but with the clipboard. So that'll highlight throughout the standards where you need to have an individual case approach. I might pop two up at the same time. So these next two, one with kind of the smallest person in a group highlighted and one with the largest highlighted. So absolutely right. The one with the smallest person highlighted is to highlight when there are issues around early childhood. And then with the largest person highlighted is adolescence, just as we've seen from one of our colleagues in the chat box. So I'll pop a few more up. So we've got this one in the top right corner that looks a bit like a little paint splotch. You can figure out what you think that one is. And then this one in the center that is a bit of a magnifying glass with an arrow in it. Any ideas on either of these? Yeah, infectious diseases, absolutely. So with that, as Joanna mentioned in the beginning, infectious disease outbreaks was a humanitarian context we wanted to be sure we were covering more clearly. And so that's now highlighted throughout the standard. And as we just heard, the other one is indeed about measurement and indicators. I'll just speed through these last two. To see if you have an idea about what the sort of hand with a person and the shield with a person indicate. So a few different ideas coming up. So the hand with the person in the center of it is for issues of safeguarding, which we definitely have tried to have kind of a stronger emphasis throughout on where we need to consider safeguarding concerns in our programming, recognizing that that's not just work for our HR colleagues, but kind of across the humanitarian response. And then the shield with a person in it is prevention, so reflecting some of those concerns throughout and being sure that that's a focus of our programming. So this is sort of the full list together for you, just to see all of the icons that you'll see. And again, these are kind of prompts, kind of visual cues for colleagues as they're looking throughout the standards to reflect on what they mean for the work and to make sure that we're incorporating some of those cross-cutting issues. So I will start taking you through some of the major changes that we've done in the 2019 edition now. I'll kind of try and unpack it by each of the separate pillars. So this that you're looking at right now is the 2012 edition, which you will all sort of know and remember. And if I click, you see the 2019 edition. It's the same structure. It's now 28 standards across the same 4 pillars and with our 10 principles threaded throughout, which you see in these sort of puzzle pieces going around the standards. One change that you will notice, kind of heard alluded to when Joanna was talking about what was guiding us in our revision, is a strengthened emphasis on our 10 principles. The principles themselves haven't changed, but we have added some concrete applications to explain them. All 10 have been grouped in one section, kind of with equal weight, and they're also highlighted under each standard and hyperlinked so that you can easily go back and check on them in the online version and in the app. So that's kind of one change that you'll sort of see straight up front. And the other is that there's a stronger kind of overall introduction right at the beginning of the CPMS that provides a deeper explanation of child protection and humanitarian action, its international legal basis, the CPMS themselves, who they're for, how to use them, connections with other standards, and cross-cutting issues. And this edition was very much in response to feedback from country-level consultations, where a range of partners and particularly local actors were saying that they needed this kind of foundation, this background to where child protection comes from and why it's important. all of these different connections to really be able to do their work, and in some cases to help support them to do internal advocacy within their own agency, or externally through the cluster system, through other coordination mechanisms. So I'll try and take you briefly through the major changes in each of the pillars now. And just to note, I'm going to take you through the major changes now, but please, I can see some things popping up in the chat box. Please continue to use that to ask your questions. I'm presenting things now, but we'll have time at the end to answer questions and to discuss options for rollout. So please feel free to keep adding those as they kind of come to your mind. So first is pillar 1. These are the standards to ensure a quality response. So one of the major, and I think most important changes in this pillar is in standard 1. So the standard on coordination was co-written by the Global Child Protection Area of Responsibility and UNHCR together. So they helped us to draft this standard to be sure that it clearly explains what to expect and how to get involved in coordination structures, whether you're in a refugee setting or in a cluster setting. And I think this is a really important way that Pillar 1 has kind of improved and helps to be more applicable across a range of humanitarian contexts. Other changes in these groups of standards are in standard 4, which is on program cycle management. There are stronger links to kind of child development and a broader protection lens kind of throughout the different stages of program cycle management. The information management standard, which is standard 5, had some fairly significant updates to reflect new information management terms, tools that have been developed in the last years, and also to have a stronger emphasis on ethical concerns. So particularly guidance around informed consent and assent processes with children. And throughout this pillar, there's a stronger emphasis on child safeguarding and protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. And you'll see that highlighted through that icon that we showed you just a few moments ago. So those are the major changes in Pillar 1. I'll take you briefly through Pillar 2 now. So Pillar 2 is the pillar on child protection risks. So kind of before I go into the particular changes that have happened in some of the standards, I think there's a great overall introduction at the beginning of Pillar 2 that has this sort of visual diagram that you see kind of on the slide in front of you. And it's really stressing the interconnected nature of these standards. It's one child after all, and I know for all of you who are out there doing this work, it is so rare for us to find a child or a family who's only experiencing one of these risks. And so the new edition of the CPMS does try to prompt you to look across standards and to have kind of an interconnected and more systematic approach. So the introduction does that, and at the beginning of each of these standards, you'll also notice that they list linked standards, which actually in the online version you are hyperlinked and you can click on and jump to the linked guidance. So all of these cues to really encourage kind of more holistic thinking when we're developing and implementing our programming. So the major changes in this pillar come in Standard 8, which is the standard on physical and emotional maltreatment, and also in Standard 9 on sexual and gender-based violence. So Standard 8, many of you might remember, was previously the standard on physical violence. It now expands its focus to also consider physical and emotional neglect and also emotional abuse. It builds on new guidance and research from the Inspire handbook, from the World Health Organization, and from the Alliance's own research on child neglect in humanitarian settings. So it really emphasizes the serious short and long-term negative impacts on children of physical and emotional maltreatment in a range of settings. And it provides guidance on prevention and a coordinated response. Standard 9 similarly has been updated to have an expanded focus. So it was previously the standard on sexual violence, and it now includes a broader focus on gender-based violence, while also recognizing that children, both girls and boys, face particular risks and needs related to sexual violence. So the new standard kind of acknowledges the root causes of GBV are kind of harmful social and gender norms that promote gender-based discrimination and unequal power. And where there are basic SGBV services in place and the environment is relatively stable, there are interventions aimed at promoting gender equality and systematic change to social and gender norms are encouraged. It also strengthens guidance on a survivor-centered approach, which was a big feedback from the 2012 edition, that there needed to be kind of added emphasis on there. And there's also new and improved guidance on confidentiality and on child marriage. So hopping along to pillar 3, which Hani kind of teased for you at the beginning. Pillar 3 is the pillar to develop adequate strategies, and it's also the one where you will see the most changes in the 2019 edition. The pillar itself has been restructured and framed around the socio-ecological model. So as that's the kind of egg-shaped diagram that many of you will see in the center of your screen, and many of you might be very familiar with from your own work. So the idea is that the socio-ecological model really provides a concrete framework that supports systems thinking for child protection programming. It helps to identify ways that factors at interconnected levels influence children's development and well-being. So rather than looking at a single protection issue or a single specific service on its own, Pillar 3 really promotes consideration of the full range of problems facing the child, their root causes, and the solutions available at different levels, either at the child's level, in the family, in the community, and the broader society. And it also links, Pillar 3 now also links with the Inspire package where appropriate. And when you do kind of look at the handbook in your hands or look at the online version, you'll see that there are some icons to link to Inspire and build on kind of their evidence-based strategies for preventing violence against children. So I'll take you briefly through some of the major changes in this pillar. So there are a couple of new standards. There's standard 16 on strengthening family and caregiving environments. This was really seen as a gap in the previous edition and reflects the family really is the first and the most important level of protection for children. This standard, places the child at the heart of that family and stresses that child protection workers must look to how they're providing supports to parents and caregivers and how they're building on the strengths of the family. Well, of course, we always carefully assess any risks there are to the child. We want to make sure that we're providing kind of appropriate supports to keep children in family-based environments. There's also some guidance on what to do in infectious disease outbreaks when it might make it difficult for families to stay together due to kind of disease control measures. There's a new standalone standard on alternative care. While this also has links to unaccompanied and separated children, which is where guidance on alternative care was housed in the 2012 edition, it also highlights that alternative care is a really important part of our sort of toolkit of approaches for child protection and humanitarian action, that it may be a service that is required for children who aren't unaccompanied and separated, and it makes really important linkages with case management and with the new standard on strengthening family and caregiving environments. There are also 3 standards within this pillar that underwent quite significant updates. So I know many of you might be looking at the list and wondering, where is the standard on child-friendly spaces? And the answer is that there isn't one. So standard 15, which is now the standard on group activities for child well-being, replaces the previous standard on CFSs. This is really reflecting that both at the global and the country level, many practitioners and experts felt that there was an over-reliance on this one type of intervention, that, you know, child protection and humanitarian action equals child-friendly spaces. And this is trying to reflect like our broad range of evidence that there are a range of group activities for supporting children's well-being that might be considered when it comes to mobile programming, to links to skills training and other regular and consistent opportunities for improving children's protection. So it really is kind of encouraging colleagues to go through that appropriate kind of step-by-step process of contextual and needs analysis and choosing the right type of group activities that are applicable to the context in which they're working, rather than kind of by default going to this one type of intervention. You'll also notice that standard 17, now the standard on community level approaches, has undergone some significant updates, and this is really working towards more community-led and community-driven processes, recognizing that there has been a tendency sometimes in the past to have one-size-fits-in community processes that were very driven by humanitarian actors themselves, that said, oh, we're going to establish this mechanism or this group, rather than kind of looking at what were the communities' already established ways of dealing with child protection issues and kind of building upon their existing structures and traditions, and recognizing that when we do that, we can weaken communities. So this gives guidance on how to get towards those more community designed and community led processes. And the last kind of major change you'll see is in standard 20, which is the standard on justice for children. So this has been moved over. It used to be in pillar 2 on child protection risks, and now it's in pillar 3 as one of our strategies for responding to child protection risks. So this is recognizing that justice for children can be both a risk and a protective strategy. And it reflects evidence through the Global Working Group's 2015 desk review. We became kind of more aware of the many interactions that children have with the formal, informal, and traditional justice systems, and also recognizing that a crisis may present a unique opportunity for teams to strengthen systems that may otherwise resist change. So using the socio-ecological model, this standard encourages collaboration with a full range of actors to assess the ways in which the legal and justice systems at all levels either provide protection or present risks, and then to develop interventions to reinforce protection and to overcome those risks. So that is pillar 3, which, as promised, had kind of the most changes. And I'll briefly present to you pillar 4 now, which, as Hani also kind of foreshadowed in his introduction, is the pillar to work across sectors. You might remember from the 2012 edition, it was previously focusing almost exclusively on child protection mainstreaming, and our thinking has sort of evolved. So this edition tries to strike a balance between specific dedicated child protection programming, which we recognize will be required in the majority of responses, but also looking at closer collaboration with other sectors. So there are different forms that this might take, which will obviously vary by context, but it gives you guidance on integrated approaches, on joint programming, as well as on child protection mainstreaming. And this is really reflective of the increasing recognition of the centrality of protection across all sectors, and that protection is kind of, it's the aim and the ultimate outcome of all humanitarian programming. So it's not just the responsibility of child protection or broader protection actors, but it's the responsibility of all humanitarian actors. And it highlights the increasing kind of evidence and research that shows the negative impacts of sectoral programming, which is blind to child protection risks, and demonstrates that when we work in an integrated approach and we work together, there are much more positive outcomes for children and their well-being. And I think one kind of really important thing for me to highlight about this pillar is that each of the standards were written with really close cross-sectoral collaboration. So as an example, for the standard on education and child protection, colleagues from the Global Education Cluster were involved. Similarly, for WASH and nutrition and health, kind of this is building on the leading guidance that they have for their own sector and working together to incorporate a child protection lens. So it's also, Pillar 4 can also be a really great advocacy tool for you to use for integrated programming, whether within your own agency or kind of at the interagency level. There are a few other changes just to quickly highlight, is that there are now standards on food security and child protection and livelihoods and child protection, which is a little bit of a shift from the previous edition. And distribution, which used to be included as a separate standard, is now integrated across all of the standards in this pillar, recognizing that many different sectors do distribution and that guidance needs to be sort of incorporated throughout. So within each of the standards, you'll see key actions for CP actors, for other sectoral actors, and for both CP and sectoral actors to do together. So that structure will hopefully look quite familiar to you. So those are all the kind of major substantive changes. And I think I'll just hand over to Joanna now to take you through some of the resources that we have available and some of the plans for global rollout before we turn to your questions.
So what we wanted to do was let you know a little bit about our rollout plans for this year and next year. There are 4 complementary areas to how the rollout is going to get underway, or has already really started to get underway. And I'll take you quickly through each of those areas, and hopefully they will spark ideas for you that we can have a conversation about in the discussion in the next few minutes. So the 4 areas are around raising awareness, so multilingual handbooks, online version, and app. So we've been working really hard over the past 4 months or so to translate all the materials. So the handbook, the summary of the handbook, the online annexes, this What's New presentation, and the What's New handout into French, Spanish, and Arabic. And French and Spanish will be ready next month, which is as of Sunday. It'll be available in March. And the Arabic version will be available in early April. So we're very much hoping that there will be uptake in using those resources in the various regions around the world that speak those 3 languages. Many of you will already have seen that there is an online version of the CPMS that you can access through the Alliance and other websites. And then we have the app, which has been updated from the 2012 version, which is available through Sphere and the HSP forum. And we are very much encouraging people to go digital and to use the app and to use the online version. As Suzanne has said, this is the interactive way where you can link within the document, you can link to other standards, other sets of standards, you can link to other documentation and resources and references and so on. We have these What's New webinars that we are doing now, and we'll be supporting these webinars also in French, Spanish, and Arabic as those resources come online. And we have started the development of a new introduction to CPMS video, which we hope will be available in Q2. And that will also be useful for you as you take this rollout into your own agencies and interagency coordination groups and so on. Raising awareness also will be done through the various launches. As we mentioned, there's a global launch that happened in October, but there will be regional launches, not only tied to the language editions, obviously, the translated editions, but also looking at one, for example, in East Africa, and maybe one in Bangkok. So we're looking at some of those regional launches. We also know that there will be national launches, and we're working with some countries, which primarily so far Bangladesh, Iraq, Tanzania, where there's been already great interest in taking the document up and looking at how to use the 2019 edition with the various partners, government, local NGOs, international NGOs, and so on. So the second piece is around the country level support. So we do have some financial support for a few countries in 2020, and we're always very eager to provide technical support around any of the activities you might do, such as contextualization or a launch or a training, etc. So we're hoping that countries will develop their own rollout plan. Could be quite light touch, or in some countries it might be more in depth if you're using it very heavily, or if you've never used it before and really want to take this opportunity to introduce and drive the CPMS through the preparedness or response work that you're doing. In the bottom right is our work around institutionalization. So all the members of the Alliance have signed on to uphold the CPMS and to use it in their work. So there is a tool that will be reanimating for people to measure how well they're doing in using it in their human resources, in their operations, in their capacity building, and so on. We work very closely with the other partners in the Humanitarian Standards Partnership, whether that be MERS or LEGS or SPHERE or INEE and so on. So the CPMS plays an active role and tries to, help them learn from what we're doing, learn from what they're doing, and also where possible, such as with the app platform, merge resources so that we can overall be stronger in promoting humanitarian standards. And then finally, under institutionalization is our work with donors, engaging them to come on board more strongly, whether that's through resources or becoming champions for child protection in humanitarian action, and in particular in use of standards to guide our work. And then the fourth segment is around strengthening capacities across humanitarian operations. So as part of this webinar series, we will be doing standard-specific webinars and supporting those task forces that have videos or other materials that they've developed to ensure that the 2019 edition is really well reflected and showcased. You will find all the information about those webinars or event specifics on the Alliance website or through the Alliance social media over the coming months. This is the first one in the series, and we'll be running a number of them through to June. We're working with the Learning and Development Working Group to update the face-to-face training package, the global CPHA training package, to ensure that the 2019 edition is well reflected, in particular the new standards and the reshape of Pillar 3s and 4, but obviously every single module needs some updating. And then finally, we'll be updating the CPMS e-course, which you will find on the Alliance website, to the 2019 edition, and we're in discussions with Save the Children to possibly expand that to include some of the new standards and approaches that are reflected in the current edition of the CPMS. So as you can imagine, it's quite an ambitious plan, and we're working with a number of partners, all of the working group members. So with UNHCR and the CPAOR, we're working at country level support to ensure that where countries have questions or have opportunities or have needs, that we're able to support them however we best can. And then different agencies within the working group, such as Plan International, Save the Children, UNICEF and UNHCR again, have stepped up with their own resources internally to be able to drive the CPMS either within their own agency, but also through interagency efforts, ground or at the global level. It's a large, ambitious portfolio, as I said, over these 2 years. We do not have the funding available to us at the global level as we did in 2012 and 2013. Much more of that funding now is available at regional or more at national level. So we are hoping to hear of countries, putting in a line into their budgets, into their, grant applications, saying that they will be supporting the CPMS rollout. They've developed a plan. They want to do specific trainings, or they want to do a couple of conference calls, or they want to produce the materials. For example, in Lake Chad region plan is developing some illustrations to highlight all of the different standards. So that might be something that might interest other people on the call as one of the ideas of how to really make this work at your level, and we'd love to hear about that, and then also collect it so that we can share it with others from our global vantage point. And then finally, this is just a little bit of the timeline. So we've had the global launch, and the What's New webinar and package was launched in December. We've had some donor country launches in the UK and in Norway, and we're looking at the United States, Sweden, and a few other countries over the coming months. The webinar series, which I mentioned, the global launch of the materials, of all the materials in French, Spanish, and Arabic. You'll be informed about the specific dates on social media, and obviously you will find all those materials on the Alliance website. The update of the face-to-face package is something that has started. We're waiting a little bit for the Learning and Development Working Group focal points to come online in order to be able to fully flesh out that process with them. And then obviously is ongoing for all of these country level launches and different activities. So I think with that, maybe I should just mention the hard copies, because I'm sure that's going to be one of the questions. We do have a small pool of English hard copies of actual handbooks at the global level, not as many as last time. We are distributing them through coordination groups. So if you're coming from a country, a DRC or Nepal or somewhere, their coordination group, then the coordinator makes a request. If it's a refugee coordination group, to UNHCR. If it's not, if it's a AOR, then receives a request for 20 copies or 10 or 30 copies. That's negotiated with us. And then we can ship them out to you. But as we said, as far as possible, we would love you to be printing some locally. We have a print-ready copy that we can provide to you if on request, and then also to go digital and use the app and so on for your launches and training opportunities, etc. So I think with that, we're going to open up the floor to you and hear what your thoughts are, what your questions are, and see what kind of discussion we can have in terms of what we can support you with and what ideas you have at your level. So people are raising hands, which is great.
Joanna, we've also got a few questions in the chat box.
Super. Should we start with those?
Yeah, I can maybe pose at least one of them to you. So Lydia was asking about the e-course, if it will potentially be multilingual as well.
That would be wonderful. There are no plans at the moment to make it like multilingual. One of the first things we have to do is actually a bit more research or a bit more investigation into who's using it and what are they liking about it. So before we expand it to a few more modules, that will be one step. And then we would have to go to donors and say, is it possible to make this multilingual? And if so, kind of what's the real evidence for doing that? Because we'd really need to see the numbers in order to support that kind of request to a donor.
But also perhaps just to say, for those of you who are on the call from different agencies who have resources for translation, if that's something that would be useful or that you would see as a priority, then the CPMS is always open to collaboration. So lots of options and opportunities in the future. There was another question, which I will go ahead and pose to you as well, our colleague Grace was asking if the CPMS e-course can be accessed in China.
Oh, that's a great question. I have not heard that it can't be, but I haven't had that question put to me before. So Grace, if you want to be in touch with me on a bilateral level, we can look into that together. Yeah.
And then I'll take one that I'm seeing from Burkena, who is asking about a regional launch for the Middle East or for Eastern Europe. And the answer is, at the moment, there is a plan hasn't been formed for a launch in the Middle East or a regional launch in the Middle East or for Eastern Europe. As a CPMS working group, we would be really thrilled to do it. We just haven't had a working group member come forward yet. So if it's something that you or your agency would be interested in doing with a broader group of individuals, please be in touch with myself and with Joanna, and we'll put up our email address for the CPMS working group at the end, so that you can, anyone who's kind of interested in different collaboration can reach out to us. There's also another comment from Burkena just about donor engagement, about knowing kind of the list of donors where we've been engaged and how we could reinforce more humanitarian actor agency who's preparing proposals to use the minimum standards as their guide and to reference them explicitly. We, you know, I can speak for Save the Children and say that we certainly do, and also to say that, you know, as you kind of saw from the beginning of the presentation, the CPMS are very much our benchmark and our guide as a sector. I know there was a broad range of donors that we had engaged in the past with the 2012 edition, and there's some work now for the 2019 edition to update our guidance to donors and again to kind of reach out to them to encourage the use of the CPMS in their own evaluations of proposals. But I don't know if Joanna wanted to add anything more to that.
No, I think that's a good summary. So, you know, we're eager to hear from you of any donors who may be interested, whether that's a private foundation or a company or a government donor, and eager to work with you, whether, you know, it's passed to us the opportunity or we work with you at national level or at regional level to see if there might be something that we could put together or support you to propose. There is a hand up I saw. Is there Eric? Do you want to pose a question? Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Joanne, for the chance. I don't have a question, but I just an observation and the comment on regarding the new edition. I'm glad to be part of the revision of CPMS, especially in South Sudan. I'm by name Eric Isairo, working with Hold the Child. And I think in South Sudan, we are happy to receive the new edition. And as part of the Child Protection AOR, Area of Responsibility, as one of the activities which we have for 2020 is to make sure that the new revised edition is rolled out across the country. And already we have started in which in major coordination meetings to do with child protection. We have already started like in the MHPSS working group where we had the presentation which we have seen, which was Susanna was going through. And the lucky thing is we had comments from members who attended that meeting, and they were asking questions about the new icons. I think is something which is new, and they appreciated about connecting the standards by use of icons, which will be easily when maybe partners are, or maybe practitioners are using the revised edition. And personally, I've been able to go through the revised edition, and I've been integrated some of the standards in maybe in the drafting proposals. And I believe that it is a tool which will help us as those who are working in a humanitarian setting. And I believe that the new edition will be a tool which can be used by anyone in terms of intervention. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's lovely to hear how positive you are about the 2019 edition. It's also really good to hear how it has already come to South Sudan. I believe that some of the hard copy handbooks have been delivered there by now. And that you're starting to look at actual rollout with partners such as colleagues in MHPSS, and because we really do want to make sure that this edition is owned by all of the humanitarian actors and that everybody understands the role that they have to play in protecting children in the various settings in which we're working. Perhaps, you know, on the screen you'll see under point 5 that there is a summary of the minimum standards because, as we know, like the whole document can be quite daunting when you're given the brick. You know, and if you're working in nutrition and you haven't thought very much about protection of children and how you're working together, yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming to be given that. So the summary, there is a version 2, which will be up in the next week or so, is a really good entry point for colleagues who are in other sectors, or, people who are very, very busy, who don't, their full job is certainly not the protection of children, but they should be aware. It's a wonderful entry point. So I would encourage you to download that, and again, maybe even print 100 or 200 or 300 copies in your local setting. It's obviously much cheaper to print such a small document. It's laid out just the same as the main handbook, with the color coding and so on, though it doesn't have the icons, which is something which is interesting to note, and I like that comment, Eric. Thank you.
There were just a couple of more questions that were popping up in the chat box, Joanna. So one of them was from Miriam, who was asking about how Rollout is organized at the country level and how civil society organizations are included in the process. So maybe I can comment briefly on that one, Miriam. Hopefully, as you heard a little bit from Eric in South Sudan, that in that case, I think it was primarily initiated by the child protection subcluster, and that kind of all the different members and actors within the child protection subcluster, which I know includes quite a lot of local and national actors like Eric's and civil society organizations, as well as international agencies and humanitarian actors. So I think the coordination groups are usually sort of the first port of call in terms of organizing Rollout. And I know in some other countries, sometimes an individual agency has taken it upon themselves to propose it to the wider child protection coordination group. So we definitely really encourage that sort of interagency approach. And as you just heard from Joanna as well, that, when rollout plans are being developed, that it's really, we really encourage that sort of cross-sectoral collaboration and including other sectors, clusters or working groups, and including determining how you can reach out to some of the senior members of like the humanitarian country team and those kinds of people who make decisions about funding and about the structure of the humanitarian response. So it's very down to individual countries to determine how they want to prioritize it, but we kind of encourage this broad tent, I would say. Joanna, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a great summary. Thanks. Were there other questions?
There was one more about hosting a global workshop or conference on the CPMS.
Interesting. Let's hear more. I mean, we did have the global launch in October, and there was a lovely amount of time that we were able to spend with participants able to come to the annual meeting, as well as live stream it to people around the world. But it would be interesting to know, I don't know who put the comment forward, but if you want to speak to an idea, or if there may be a way that we can present at different global conferences that are already planned by others, we would absolutely love to know about that. Yes.
I think those are all the questions that we have in the chat box at the moment. I'll just highlight for anyone who hasn't kind of seen it on the slide, is this web address that's up there at the top is where you can access all of these different resources that are available on the CPMS, including the online version, the Humanitarian Standards Partnership app, which you can have in your pocket if you'd like to download it and have it on your phone. And to say that that's, as Joanna's mentioned a couple times, we really encourage colleagues to turn to these online resources as much as possible, knowing that we will print and distribute as many copies of the physical handbook as we can, giving our funding, but that the online resources are available to you right now, and are kind of instantly put a CPMS handbook on everyone's computer and in everyone's pocket. So to be aware of those. We have another few minutes booked, so if there are any other questions, you're really welcome to either raise them in the chat box or raise your hand if you'd like to contribute. A really good question. Is it possible to share the PowerPoint? So this PowerPoint that we've been presenting today is part of the What's New briefing pack. So it goes together with a 2-page document that summarizes all the major changes in the CPMS, and it's available on that same website that you see at the top of your screen. So if you would like to use it in your own work, you can go there and download it, and it's freely available. Joanna, at the moment, I think those were all of the questions that we had. Is there anything that you would like to add before we kind of conclude for the afternoon?
Well, I think there's been some really good questions, and it's nice to hear as well that there's starting to be the uptake at the country level of the 2019 edition. I'm seeing another comment from Frank about saying that the CPMS is important in the development of education proposals in his context. It's wonderful to know that it's not only the child protection actors that are using it, but already some collaboration, integration with other sectors is happening using this new edition. So that's lovely to see. I would be saying just stay tuned. We have lots that is going on, as you can see in the rollout plan. The next big piece will be around the delivery of those 3 languages. So the resources, all the resources in those 3 languages. And that will be happening, as I said, in March and April. All of the information, all of the updates, all of the different things that are going on will be on the Alliance website or in the social media. So do pay attention to those newsletters or little alerts that come out, because you may find that there's some kind of webinar that interests you, or the video is being released, etc. We're always looking for collaborations. So if you have an idea of something that that would be useful for you at the national level or the regional level or even at the global level, then we are all ears. We're really wanting to hear what ideas you have and how we could support them. We are, hoping that there'll be lots of uptake, and innovation in the rollouts that are happening at national level. So if you want to talk through some of that with us before committing it to paper, that's great. And otherwise, I'm just going to wish people well and thank you for your time here, and say, yes, let's all get to work on using this updated 2019 version.
Just to add my thanks to everyone, it's been really such a pleasure to have a great, active and large group of colleagues from all around the world. And I, like Joanna, hope to hear from you and look forward to working with you on the rollout of the 2019 edition.